Great. Yeah, so my name is Shane Rafferty, and we've had a few great presentations on 3D printing over the last 2 years at this symposium. But I kind of felt like, well, what's the next step? How can we talk about integrating 3D printing once you have one on site? So that's kind of the focus of this presentation. So I figured I'd do a quick introduction of myself. So I am the patient technology specialist at Lurie Children's in Chicago. I actually have my background as a child life specialist in multiple different settings. I always kind of try to integrate technology and that type of stuff into my care plans and things like that. And I was always the go-to, hey, the iPad's not working, or hey, we need the Xbox working person. So it was kind of baked into my background anyway. But through Child's Play, I was able to get a grant and transition to full-time back in August 2021. And now I am actually officially sponsored by my hospital. So that's really great that they decided to keep me. But then prior to this experience with 3D printing, I was aware of it, but have never had hands-on stuff or did any 3D modeling. And we were able to, I think, acquire one back early 2022. So we've had it for almost 2 years now. So I figured, even though this isn't about what 3D printing is, I figured to give a quick kind of step-by-step what it is for people that aren't super familiar with it. So pretty much what you can do, you either find 3D models online or numerous resources, or if you're savvy enough and want to commit a lot of time to working on a project, designing or modifying something yourself, you then bring that into a program that is called a slicer, which takes that 3D model and slices it horizontally, because that's how the printer works. It goes, prints one layer, moves up a tiny bit, like 0.2 millimeters typically, prints another one, prints another one, prints another one. So these slicer programs will tweak that depending on your printer settings and stuff like that, and turn it into a G-code file, which you then load into a 3D printer, and then it will print that kind of layer by layer, as I mentioned before. And then you think you'd be done once that's printed, but there actually is a lot of post-processing work, cutting off supports, sanding things so they're not rough, gluing things together if they're big, painting if you want to get really fancy. So it is kind of an involved process. It takes a little bit of work. But that's just like the basic step-by-step. So then kind of talking about like, how can this be used in healthcare? What are the unique situations that we have to think about using 3D printing in a healthcare setting? The first one is that there are two major types of printers. There is fused deposition modeling, which is FDM, or stereolithography, which is SLA. Those are usually, people refer to those as like resin printers. So they use flashing LED lights that cure the resin and kind of lift it up over time. So they're really great in making kind of smaller, more precise, highly detailed models. However, resin printing, there's fumes. There's a lot of post-processing needing like alcohol soaks and things like that. So really not the best fit for healthcare setting, because most of hospitals don't have windows or access to ventilation or anything like that usually. So we usually kind of would recommend sticking with FDM, which is your filament, and just kind of printing that layer by layer, which you guys may be more familiar with. Another aspect about 3D printing is that a lot of these printers that you buy are kind of designed for the tech-savvy hobbyists and things like that. So some require building. It can take 3 hours of going and meticulously screwing in belts and adding motors and tweaking stuff. Or there are turnkey models that are just, you take it out of the box, you take the, maybe attach one thing, plug it in, and it's good to go. Obviously, the turnkey models can be a little bit more expensive than the ones you build yourself, but that, from my experience, has been a better fit for the healthcare environment, not only because it's just easier to do, but they are typically designed for classrooms, libraries, and places like that, so it's a little easier to sell your hospital on it versus something that literally is just bits of metal and things that can get to 200 degrees Celsius that they might be a little scared of. That just kind of goes into the other aspect of it. The 3D printing culture is very into like modifications and building new stuff, upgrading things, and doing that type of stuff. So once again, if you buy those turnkey models, you're pretty much kind of stuck with how they're designed, or you will often have to buy proprietary upgrades or things to replace. So that's just something to keep in mind. Or if you want to be adventurous and get those more basic models, you can really upgrade and do a lot of cool stuff. If you dive on the internet, people have made insane modifications on that. But once again, great for your hobby, not necessarily the best fit for a healthcare environment. Next part is learning curve. So as I kind of mentioned, there is a lot of things to learn and kind of figure out when doing 3D printing. So the first thing is slicing software, as I mentioned before, that is essential to 3D print. You can't do without it. This screenshot is an example of a software called Cura. It's open source. You can kind of use it. There's a lot of user-based modifications, a lot of great resources out there, but it does take time to just figure out the nuances of the program and getting your settings for your specific printer. So each printer, even in the same company, will have different tweaks to get the ideal setting, and that can take a long time of just printing and, oh, this failed, this didn't work, or this one looks awful, just trying to find that sweet spot, and that just takes a long time to do. Already talked about that, and yeah, just getting those machines setting, but also troubleshooting. Like anyone who has a 3D printer knows that filament can get jammed. There can be tangles in your filament, so then it gets stuck and it rips off and you can't get the filament out of the tube, and it's just there. You have to kind of work that into your workflow of like, okay, there might be astronomical problems with this, so you're going to have to spend an afternoon taking things apart, figuring out how it works, and like diving in there versus calling up a company and figuring out, because some groups are great with their customer service. Others, there's a lot of these companies that are based out of China, which those tech companies just across the board may not have the best customer service, but lots of great resources online and Reddit, other communities and stuff like that. I've spent way too much time just digging through that in videos and things like that. Then the other aspect is really diving into 3D modeling itself and building models from scratch. So as I mentioned, I had zero experience with that, so I just am the type of person that will dive into a program and just screw around, mess around until I can figure out how things work. It's probably not the most efficient way to learn something, but definitely figured it out at some set. But that is another thing, that being able to have time to like sit down and mess around with the programming, really spend maybe a whole day just building a model of something like that, and having that flexibility in your workflow will be very beneficial in kind of elevating what your hospital can use with 3D printing. So that's just something to be aware of as well. Let's click on the wrong screen. All right, there we go. Location and storage. So these are kind of bulky, so you got to have space, and that is probably the #1 thing in healthcare that we don't have. Some people I've heard about putting them on carts so you can move them around, but honestly, if you are printing something, you really need to keep it stationary. So even if it is on a wheeled cart, having a spot where you can set it to print for 15 hours straight without someone moving it or nudging it or bumping into it is kind of a really important thing. Once again, long print time. So the more complex models can take 15 to 24 hours or even more, depending on what you're doing. So not only balancing where is there a good spot for that, but also, is your hospital comfortable with you walking away from a piece of electronics that has several 200 degrees Celsius hot ends and moving plastic and things like that? So just things to keep in mind. So we personally have ours in our inpatient playroom. It's behind a staff desk, so patients and families can't touch it or mess with it, but they can see it. It's a great conversation piece. It's moving, there's colors. I found that that's probably one of the best ways I've gotten patients and families interested in, just by having it out and printing some stuff, and also having a space to display any 3D printed models you may have been working on is another way to kind of generate excitement for it. So that's something to keep in mind with location and storage. So that's just quick, brief, not really brief, I talked a bunch about 3D printing in healthcare. Now we're going to kind of talk about 3 of the major ways that I have found to integrate this into kind of the social emotional support with different teams in my hospital. Oh, and just in general, there are limitless applications what you can do with 3D printing, and we'll kind of dive into that right now. So first one I want to talk about is adaptive equipment. So these are just tools that patients that may not have the same like dexterity limitations or strength limitations, and these can really just help them do or normalize a lot of activities and things like that. I, for a time, worked at an inpatient rehab hospital for a few years. So I got to work very closely with the rehabilitation team and really learned kind of a lot about the nuances of getting these like pieces of tools, plastic and stuff. And it can be very hard and very expensive because it's healthcare. So 3D printing is fantastic because we can print stuff for very cheap and give it to patients. Yeah, and this can be either like a short-term thing if like a patient is sedated or coming out of something or gaining strength back. That might be something they just use at the hospital, or this may be a aspect that can be used throughout the rest of their lives and stuff like that. So it's really kind of different varying needs with that. Once again, as I mentioned, commercially, these objects are often very expensive, the typical healthcare model. And also the stuff that is available commercially usually has a very kind of specific intended implementation. So it can be hard to modify or tweak to the individual or if there's a specific task. Which with 3D printing, you can go in and modify and adapt things. So that's really excellent. As I mentioned, less expensive. This is kind of why 3D printing is a good option for adaptive equipment. I have some. One more. Yeah. So that's another thing too, is that most of these tools are focused on fine motor aspects just because the size of 3D printing is smaller. There are obviously larger commercial models that do. You may have seen like casts or splints or things like that, but from our level, that's once again not only feasible, but not really in our scope of practice, but I will talk about that later. Show some pictures, so it's not just me talking and boring. So this is something that I worked with our creative art therapist, so our music therapy and art therapy team. I was able to find an adaptive ring tool. So this is for patients that may not have the fine motor strength or dexterity to grip a paintbrush or a drumstick. And we figured out a way to modify that and just slap it on a finger. We made different models that have a vertical orientation or horizontal. So depending on what movements the patient can do, we can modify it to meet their needs there. What was available online was an adult size. So I had to go in and kind of tweak it, shrink it down. So that's where that modification of going in and finding models and tweaking it to your population can be important. But like you can lots of other things. So that was mostly for music and art therapy. There are also these two models where just someone did all the work for me. I didn't even have to design anything. I just printed it. And this is, once again, two different models of ways for patients that can do drawing, expression, that type of stuff, but they may not be able to grip it there. So just having kind of like a whole repertoire of different tools and just like, hey, we'll try this one. Like that doesn't work. Okay, we'll try this one and tweak it around. And as I mentioned before, the best part is that you leave these with the patient. Like the blue model probably costs in material 20 to 50 cents to print. So these are some things that are meant to be given and used. So then that way they can continue doing this when they're not working with a therapist or a game tech or something. So it's continued normalization while they're in this environment as well. That is also not just limited to fine motor stuff. I was consulted for a patient who had recently lost their vision while hospitalized. So diving in and trying to figure out, okay, what can we do to just bring in some fun stuff for them? So I talked with the family and talked with the patient. They really enjoyed playing board games and Yahtzee, so I was able to go online and find these dice that have the pips on it raised, so they could roll those dice, and they're pretty large too, so it's easier to grab. So they could play a game of Yahtzee even though the patient could not see the dice. And then the other example here, this is a 3D puzzle box. So I think they're normally designed for like birthdays or something. You put money in it and you lock it up and the kid has to do that. But this is a challenging cognitive game that doesn't require vision. So this was something the patient could do and mentally map where the maze was, but it was something that was engaging and just somewhat simulating for a situation where they were, I believe, in their late preteen. So like this was something new and kind of traumatic for them. So just trying to bring some normalcy, some excitement into their life. And you could order this from Amazon. It could cost $30, $60, or you can print it in an afternoon and give it to them the next day. So that's just one aspect of 3D printing. It's so nice. So who would be interested in using adaptive equipment? As I mentioned, creative art therapist is just a great way to give them tools to work with a wider range of patients, or maybe patients that were frustrated in the limited tools that they currently have. Less time for them specifically adapting activities. I know if you've ever worked with any of those specialists, that a lot of the time is just figuring out, like, okay, how can I get this patient to play an instrument or do painting or things like that? So that gives them more opportunities to actually do the interactions with patients. And also they are fantastic with coming up with ideas, and like a few of these, like I would have never thought about. So just working and collaborating with them has been excellent. Child life, of course, I think it's just another increased opportunity for normalization through play, more autonomy and independence in their day-to-day. I think that's a huge thing of just letting kids be able to do stuff without a staff person there to help them, and just especially with if patients are lost fine motor or strength, or this is something new that can be really hard for them. So giving them some sense of like a win in their column is a big thing. Once again, just helping with like frustrations of their limitations. Rehabilitation, as I mentioned, that's kind of where my background was with kind of learning more about this. It may directly support the patient's goal, which is great. And it definitely can make their needed exercise or movements that they're working on more engaging, more fun than just like, all right, we have to move your arm left and right. Like, oh, hey, let's get a drumstick and you have to hit these two things on the left and right. Especially for younger kids, it can be really hard, to convince them to do a lot of the exercises that are necessary. And it's also just easier and more equitable distribution of resources. Like insurance is really stingy about providing some tools and things like that. So if we're able to print them and just give them to families, then when they're discharged from the hospital, they can continue working and doing all this great stuff that we're able to provide here. So just a few things to be aware of. I would always say, always consult with your care team before implementing these tools with patients. Depending on the goals of the patient or what they're working on, some movements or positions may cause more harm than good. So I always recommend talking with any of the rehabilitation teams, like, hey, this patient has mentioned this, like, is this okay with you guys? Is this going to be in what you're working on? And usually if not, then we collaborate, we come up with a solution. But just you don't want to go in there and just like, hey, here you go, do all this stuff and set a kid back from what they're working on. And the other aspect too, we want to be very careful about not overstepping our boundaries. We have a lot of great professionals that went to school, years of training, and just because I can print a cool thing doesn't mean that I'm an expert on that now. So once again, just having an open communication and conversation with specialists before you're like, I'm going to solve this problem for you. But it's a great opportunity for co-treating or interdisciplinary projects. I will say that setting up this type of stuff, it may require some reminders for peers to actually utilize it. I've had to tell myself this numerous times that just underutilization is not necessarily a reflection of the usefulness of these tools. Working in healthcare is chaotic. We have tons of patients. Everyone has tons of patients, so sometimes it just doesn't cross people's mind because it's something new. So working on how to integrate that into their thought process, creating flyers, handouts, trainings every quarter or something like that. That will help refresh people and kind of utilize that more often. Even just accessibility, having a stock of these in a central location that these teams may work in and just visually available versus shoved in the back of a closet. You'll be surprised how much impact that actually has of people actually utilizing and taking advantage of it. So that is adaptive equipment. Finding models. So these are like, where do you get this stuff? There's a lot of 3D printing repositories online. Thingiverse, Printables, Yegi is just a general search engine. Large catalogs, they're typically updated a lot. Most of them are free, which is always good. And there's groups and communities that like to share models. I will say a lot of these don't have the best search engine. You might type something in and it's not really doesn't really fit what you're doing. There is some older content on there, so sometimes it's good for us to dig around and find that and then share models with families if we want to do that. Just be aware it's the internet. Nothing too crazy though. So this is a website I found called Create Together. They just have a bunch of adaptive tools on there. They're all free to download, so that's a great resource. Most of them are sized to adults, so you may need to mod them yourself. And I don't know how often they update because I've looked at it over the last 2 years and I don't know if anything new has been added, but it's still all great applicable tools. And also you can always just make your own. You can modify existing stuff, create things specifically for patients on their unique needs. You can share it with the community so then someone else doesn't have to make it. So that's always a great thing. Like I said, it does take some time to learn how to use modeling. It can be time intensive, so just something to be aware of. All right, next we're going to talk about medical education tools. This was probably something when I first got the 3D printer was one of the first things that popped into my mind, because coming from a child life background, medical education, medical play is such a huge, important thing, and trying to use as many real medical materials as possible is so important for normalization and that type of stuff. But they're expensive and they take lots of money to get, and people don't want to give them away. So usually if we do have some real things, it's like one G tube that we have to use for 3 units, and like make sure that kid doesn't take it or you lose it, because you're not going to get another G tube. So that's where 3D printing is a great thing to come in, that we can kind of do that ourselves and give them away, which is excellent. Get ahead of myself. That's another thing too, that when 3D printer stuff, they can keep it. You don't have to get that back. This is something that they can have, which is also, I think, another opportunity to continue medical play just with parents or siblings when child life or someone else isn't available, a huge thing. Last but not least, that there are consumer teaching tools are expensive, not just the ones we get for free at the hospital. And they often are very kind of a limited scope. I know any child life specialist knows the lovely, unique teaching dolls that we get to work with sometimes, and they have not been probably updated since like 1987. So but that's what's out there. So you have to kind of deal with it. And it's the same thing too. Some of these companies that become what we rely on for these tools just can disappear. And then like, all right, now I don't know where to buy this prep book, or I don't know where to buy this anymore. So being able to kind of create your own and have your own is a little bit more consistent, which is nice. So who would be interested? So number one, of course, child life. That was kind of the main population I thought would be useful for this. So I specifically spoke with our child life team and said, hey, we're going to start printing some medical education tools. What are some items that you guys use a lot? What would you need? And so asking your team, seeing where the need is, that's like a good place to start. And then once you kind of have the bread and butter done, you can start working with specializations and narrow it down on very specific stuff. So like these pictures are, we have 2 G tubes, an open and closed one. We have some metaports, which actually have, that model uses hot glue, so you can do needle play on that, which is great. And then the one on the right is a Berlin heart model. And then what I did is I created kind of a medical library where these items are stored and can be restocked. So child life is able to use that, grab them whenever they want, and then I just restock them as best as I can. And these are used for patients, can be used for siblings, can be used for parents, really, whatever child life wants to use them for. I'm just the person that provides them. They decide how they want to utilize it. I think I have a note. Yeah. So this is a picture of kind of our the medical library, fancy name we use for it. And I stole some equipment management philosophy from nursing. I think it's called like Kanban, where you have 2 different kind of tubs. So in theory, theory is the key word. Child life will take a tool as they need it from the front section. Then once that is empty, they would email me, reach out to me like, hey, this is empty. I would come back, move the ones in the back forward, and then print the next one. So ideally, there is always ones available. Now, kind of getting people on board with that takes some practice, but we haven't had any huge hiccups with that yet. These can be like, and I think another aspect of this is using, like having, like you can see I have a Shiley and a Benova, I think I pronounced that right, 2 different types of trach, and I think that's really important too, because then we can give the exact trach or the exact medical tool that this kid is getting versus like, oh, here's a trach, yours may look a little bit different versus like, this is the one that you're going to have. So I think there's a little bit more weight behind that, which is really nice too. So that's another aspect of having those each individual nuances between all the different models. Also, you can work with physicians or other departments, and this is kind of what happened, that we the word spread that we had a 3D printer. So our radiology team reached out to me, and they were looking to print MRI coil. So that's like the big bulky thing that sits over a kid's head if they're getting a brain or head scan that kind of tells the MRI where to go. And they were looking for a prep tool to help kind of put this on a patient prior to doing that to see if they need sedation and things like that. So I ambitiously said, yes, let's try. So I was able to do a 3D scan of the top point, and after several days of modeling and printing, you can see this in its early stages of still needing to be kind of finished up, a life-size version of that they are now going to use for preparations ahead of time. So we didn't print the bottom part because we figured just laying down and having that sitting on their head would help, but that has been another example of like you can do the smaller stuff or you can do the really bigger stuff. And it's a great way to kind of collaborate with teams you may not work with that often. Like when I was in child life, definitely worked in medical imaging a lot, but as like a game tech, that's not really an area that we are in that often. So being able to work and get the world out there, and then that leads to opportunities for other projects that they may like, oh, you do this stuff too. Okay, we can work on that as well. Also great for satellite campuses and other places that may not have the full resources of the main hospital. So I know that they are always looking for anything and something we can print and give them, like, this is yours, do what you want with it, goes a long way. So what to be aware of, very time consuming this is. So creating these models can take a lot of time. I did a combination of 3D scans of the smaller ones, but then I also ended up having to just model some from scratch just because they didn't scan really well. That took a few hours, took a few tweaks to get it going. So the initial aspect of it can take a long time, but once you have a model, you can just print it and you're good to go. Like I said, even getting them all printed, trying to stock one of those libraries can take several days to a week just because you can only print so much. But once you get that going, then just keeping up with it isn't too bad. The post-processing, particularly with larger models, may take several times. Like the MRI coil, I not only had to put it together, glue it, let the glue dry, I had to fill in the cracks, paint it with a primer, paint it with a coat, and then paint it with an enamel coat. So that's just like days after days letting things dry and dry. So it can be a long, extended period of time. And that's in between doing every other aspect of our job. So just being aware that you're working with a department, give yourself some wiggle room working on this type of stuff. Also, appropriate usage. I really encourage our staff to use it as needed. So like if they have a patient that they're going to do a teaching with that afternoon, to grab it rather than like, oh, I'm going to take 6 G-tubes and keep them in my office. That's just easier for me to stay up to date and making sure that these tools are being utilized appropriately. Yeah, just making sure that people let me know that they are out. That has happened a few times where someone's like, oh, hey, do you have any more G-tubes? We're out. I'm like, yep, I'll go print some right now. And particularly if we're working on other projects or things like that, sometimes there is kind of a line on the 3D printer. So ideally, I want to make sure that these tools are available, particularly if a sibling is coming in and they can only come in 1 day a week. We want to make sure that we have those important tools ready for them. I do keep this pretty much limited to child life only. That is something I think when we have cool stuff, staff may get really excited about it, but we also want to make sure that these tools are being utilized by the appropriate staff. So making sure that it's a child life only resource. Long-term costs, as I said, each of these models are pretty cheap, but if you're doing it very often, especially if you're taking into account time, there is some cost about it. So you might want to have a conversation if a department wants something large or specific, if they can help with funding, or at least like purchase the filament or something along those lines. Yeah, just there's something to keep in mind. We currently don't really have that big of an issue, but I could see it down the line if I'm printing 6 MRI coils in a couple months, like that's going to add up. So once again, finding models, same thing with the 3D printing repositories, don't need to go over that again. So there's a few lists out there that are curated by some of our programs. These items are created for pediatric hospitals, so it's a little bit more narrow scoped. There are only a few of us available. I think I did order this wrong, but the QR codes will pop up, and then you can model your own as well. And like I said, it's great. You can do exactly what you're looking for. Using 3D scanning cameras can be helpful, but it can take a lot of time and requires more than basic knowledge of 3D modeling for some of these more advanced models. There they are. So they're QR codes. So I have a few models. The ones that I showed here are available as STL files at this link. And Riley Hospital for Children also has a few great models, so I included theirs. Anyone else that wants to dive in this, I think there is a child life group on printables.com that has some resources there, so that's a really good spot to kind of dig in and check that stuff out. But yeah, and like I've even like last week I spent a whole morning. One of our GI child life specialists asked for me to print a stoma for medical dolls and stuff like that. So and anything that I will make will be updated on that website, so it won't be just the same thing. So in a few weeks, you may see a 3D printed stoma, which is kind of interesting, staring at stoma pictures while I'm 3D modeling earlier, but you're used to it. The last area I want to talk about is how to use 3D printing in bereavement and legacy building. During a loss and like palliative care process, physical keepsakes are usually a tool that we use a lot of times to help with the grieving and coping process for our families. Most hospitals provide either like handprints or hand molds or things like that. So we thought that 3D printing was adding something else or another variety in that option, because it is a very personal process, and some people may find hand molds, they don't like that, but then something else that we can provide through 3D printing might be a little bit more preferred. So that was just an option to go with that. And also compared to other physical items offered during bereavement, 3D printing stuff has a little bit more flexibility and wiggle room. Like if it prints poorly, you can just do it again, versus like anyone who has ever done a hand mold and a finger cracks or there's bubbles in the fingertips knows that nightmare scenario of like, oh geez, I have to fix this, and that stress and that pressure, versus 3D printing, you throw it away, you print another one. So that it's nice to be able to do that without having all that added pressure. It is typically inexpensive, and I think another aspect which really isn't super utilized right now, but like down the line, is like these digital files that we create, the files themselves can be given to the family. So if maybe at that moment they don't want to print something or have something there, we can give them that file that down the line that they can utilize in a couple years, or as we do more and more stuff with 3D modeling and 3D printing, there could be some really cool stuff that they could utilize with that we just can't do right now. All right. So it would be child life and spiritual care teams. Just another thing that during a bereavement situation, end of life, they have a lot on their plate. So if they're able to delegate a task to some other team member, they're able to more focus on that emotional support for the family. These uniqueness of the 3D printed items compared to kind of the older ones can be a nice kind of selling point for families. It's also really nice that these items can be created even after the patient has passed or is out of the hospital. One of them, which we'll talk about briefly in a second, just utilizes photographs. So that's something that families can really individualize and make specific on how they want it. Palliative care teams, this is more so for places that may not have a huge child life program or things like that. They may be limited. So being able to offer that with those groups is something that can be like take just the load off them or aspects there, which is nice. I know I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm going to go through this as quick as I can. So main thing that we use are things called lithophane. So this takes it takes a picture and it makes it kind of a photorealistic keepsake, which is great. You can use any base photo. You just have to go in, you make it black and white, you can touch things up a bit, and it comes out great. There is this website here is a tool that turns those photos into these lithophanes, and we did talk with the creator. It is something that is based off of your individual computer. It's not on the cloud, so there is no patient health information going out into the internet. It is on your computer. And the ones that I use, we can either do a stand like this, or we also have a nightlight method there too. So this is the example. This is my son that I use an example to show kind of families like what this is. So for when we use these, we usually do 2 per family, just because you have to add a limit. Otherwise, I would be printing a bunch. I put an asterisk there because there's always a circumstance where there may be 2 if it's a divorce or grandparents are part of the caregivers, but just trying to have at least some guidelines. Anyone who has worked in end of life as child life or providing those knows you just kind of have to set those boundaries. These do take a very long time to print, over 12 hours typically, just because they're very detailed. There are unique printer settings online for your printer that you need to have them print correctly. If you Google that, you'll find them easily, but you do have to go in and make unique tweaks to that. Adding the stands is something that you do need to go into a 3D modeling program and just kind of slap that on there. It's pretty easy, so it's not that big of an ask, but it does require using another program. As I mentioned, you may need to check with your hospital's policies requiring photo consent, because you are taking a photo, putting it on a computer and modifying it. So just something to be aware of. The rest of ones, these are things I've kind of experimented with. We haven't been offering them to families yet. So this was just taking a photo scan of a paint and ink handprint and turning it into a physical keepsake. Our original intention was to see if we could create a stamp. So instead of having to do 50 handprints of a patient, we can do one and kind of make a bunch of those. It didn't really work super well. Just I think the plastic was too rigid, but I think there's some aspect of it that makes it kind of a cool keepsake. I'm still kind of figuring out the best way to utilize that. So we haven't been offering it to our families yet, but this is something you guys could explore yourself and see what you can do. And all you do is you just take that. There's programs that turn it into an SVG file. You throw that into most slicers and it comes out as a 3D printed model, which is pretty cool. Also, there are doing 3D scanning. So this is a hand scan of one of my coworkers. Once again, I've just recently got a 3D scanner a few months ago. I'm not super confident using that as a resource for our patients and families yet. So I'm still learning how to do that. We've actually had a bunch of other presentations in the past talking about using 3D scanning. So I would default to them because they are the experts with that. But just from my situation so far, there's complexity with lighting, positioning, needing to hold still, that just, especially at end-of-life situations, like bringing in some other aspects seems like a little bit more chaotic. Not to say that we can't do that. It's just something I have not been able to commit the amount of time that I really should to iron out the actual process. But it's there too, and I think we're seeing kind of 3D scanning cameras doing what VR did maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where they're starting to become more approachable commercially, a little bit cheaper. So I wouldn't be surprised in a year or two if you're able to get a nice, pretty solid 3D scanning camera for not super expensive. So it's something to kind of keep up to date with, particularly with, like, I know iPhones even have LiDAR or LODAR scanning that is pretty decent. So just something to kind of keep on the foresight. Just what to be aware of. So this is generally a heavy experience. So those that have child life or other social emotional support backgrounds may be well versed in this, but a lot of game techs may not have really ever dealt with the end of life or a loss of a patient they've worked with. So that's just something, if you are tied into this or start adding this program to your workload, stepping back and being like, oh, is this something that I can really comfortable with handling? Because you can catch you off guard, and it can be a pretty big emotional fallout. So that's just like stepping back and acknowledging is like, is this something I'm ready to be able to do? And I think some people may think like this is not appropriate for my position in this role. I think that's a very important conversation to have with your manager, your team members, and really kind of setting those boundaries and guidelines from the get-go. Realistic production expectations, things like this people love, but sometimes people want to make promises like, oh, we'll get this to you tomorrow, but it takes a couple days to do, takes days to print. So just having realistic expectations with that. And enforcing those limits, I think, is just a workflow thing that it's a hard thing to say, especially in a family who's grieving and dealing with a lot, being like, oh, I have to put a limit on it. But unfortunately, that's just something you really have to do. Just really make sure your staff is aware of these limitations too, so you're not coming across as the bad guy that has to enforce that everyone's on the same page is very important. Like I said before, PHI, just be aware of what your hospital policies are and if they're comfortable with you having those photos on computers. Because honestly, using a lot of these programs, you probably can't use them on a work computer because you have to download stuff. So if your hospital is comfortable with that, or if they're not, figuring out ways to make sure that that information is protected and safe. And also, if you may need to use a consent form, it just might be easier to circumvent all that type of stuff. Here, just some quick resources on this. Printer settings, like I said, just Google them, find them online. Always do test runs a few before offering these to families, just to make sure you have everything dialed in. The lithophane stands that I designed are up on the QR code I shared before. I also have it on this website. All you need to do is just kind of take the lithophane file and the sands, and you kind of slap them together and make a new file. Both of these programs, Blender and Fusion 360, are free, so you don't have to purchase anything. I feel Blender is a little bit easier, but that's probably just a personal preference. And like I said before, with 3D scanning cameras, it does change year to year, so I currently don't have a solid recommendation. The one I have works to some extent, but it is very, you got to fight with it to get it to work. So I don't know if I'd actively recommend it for people, but who knows what's available next year. But also, once again, iPhones and all that type of stuff have crazy stuff that comes out every year too. So we may not even need a $500 3D scanning camera to do this stuff in a year or two. So that was a lot. So now what? So if you don't have a 3D printer, I would recommend watching some videos online, see what's out there, try to get one in person as soon as possible. I'm a big proponent of showing rather than telling. I have given numerous PowerPoints and conversations about stuff, and people are like, oh, that's really cool, but then it just kind of goes nowhere. But once you get technology in the space, hands-on, that's where ideas come. That's where people get excited. So I know Child's Play has equipment grants every year. That might be a great thing to see if you can get for your hospital. If you have a printer but you're intimidated by it, really just get hands-on, mess with it, print desk toys, fidgets, Pokemon, just figuring out those settings, what works, what doesn't work. You can sit and kind of be like, oh, I don't want, but really it's like it's a hobby you really have to dive into to like understand what's going on and learn the nuances of your printer. Definitely tweak settings as you go, but also take notes, because I've definitely done where I've been trying to print something and it couldn't get to work, and then I finally did, and then, oh, I don't remember what I did. So also, don't be afraid to try large, tricky, daunting models, because this will just give you opportunities to increase your skill, your mastery with this tool. I always give a caveat to patients or staff that want me to do something like, I haven't done something this big before, so let's see if we can do it. And always give yourself a loophole or a backdoor, just in case, like, okay, this isn't realistic. If you want to dive deeper into 3D modeling, internet has tons of guides, videos. There's even classes you can do that. I would definitely recommend starting with Tinkercad. So that is a web-based free online sampler. It's very much putting like boxes and things together, almost like Lego in a way. So that's where I started, and you kind of learn the basics. And then you can branch into Blender, which is more, you can actually use Blender for like animation and stuff, so it's a little bit more in that sense. Or you have Fusion 360, which is more like AutoCAD for very specific numbers and things like that. So kind of seeing what works for you, and just once again, get dirty, mess around with it, see what works, see what doesn't. Yep, see what works for you. All right, that is it. So here is just my contact information. So happy to take any emails if people just want feedback or anything like that. This is something that I'm passionate about, I'm into, so I'd love to have conversation about this. So feel free.